Hello, my name is Alana Lenton, and I'm an associate professor in cultural and social analysis. And I'm happy to have been invited by Gina Anderson to give this guest lecture for Everyday Life on the body. I'll be giving three other lectures in the course of the semester. So, before I get started, why study the body? This quote from Varga is interesting. Varga notes that the body is at the intersection of nature and culture, of the individual and society, of space and time, of corporeality and spirituality, in other words, of the connection between the mind and the body, and as such is subject to social control, but is also the seat of individuality, the material substrate of our physical existence, thought, and social relations. Well, all of that is a bit of a mouthful, but basically what Varga is trying to get across to us is that there is a strong relationship between how we as individuals inhabit our bodies and how that is related to the ways in which we are viewed by society, and also very often, although we may not always think about it, subject to the control of society, be that our peers or the state or the law, depending on the types of body we have and the ways in which we are able to move around in the world. And this may be due to gender, due to sexuality, due to race, or due to physical ability. So over the course of this lecture, I'm going to be looking at a few different topics. Firstly, we're going to be looking at what is called embodiment. In other words, how we live in or inhabit our bodies, how our bodies appear to others, and how our bodies move within the social world. And what is the connection between that and our everyday lives? So in other words, how is our body important, or how is it viewed as we go about our daily business in the world? Secondly, we're interested in the different ways in which bodies are viewed across different cultures, because of course we have a particularly Western view of the body. How may this be different when looked at from a completely different cultural perspective? Thirdly, I want to think precisely about the different ways in which various bodies are regulated or disciplined or controlled by societies. And lastly, I want to think a little bit about some new research about technology and the relationship to the body. In other words, how can things like body enhancement or cosmetic surgery and digital technologies be applied to the body more and more over time? And how do these change our relationships towards our bodies and those of society? So the first topic is the relationship between embodiment and the everyday. So embodiment speaks to our experiences of ourselves in our bodies, or our perception of our bodies in the world. The concept of embodiment originates with a group of philosophers from the early 20th century. They called themselves, or were called, phenomenologists. One of the central figures is the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and they speak about embodiment. Writers such as Merleau-Ponty showed that we do not observe our body in terms of its physiological functions, but in relation to what it can do for us. What does this mean? Physiology refers to the way in which the body functions, and they were talking about the fact that when we interact with our bodies on a daily basis, we don't always think about what precisely the body is doing. They called how we each experience the body the phenomenal body. We don't need to understand what physiological processes are necessary to observe that the body is capable of doing something. So, for example, as you're listening to me now, you may be taking notes, but you don't obviously need to know the names of all of the muscles that are involved in the act of writing, or think about how the ear through which you are hearing my lecture connects to the brain and then sends messages to the hand to write, and so on. Once we learn how to write, it becomes second nature, and we might only be concerned with thinking about our physiology or the function of the body if, for example, we can no longer write. So if you were to have an accident and lose the use of your hand, either temporarily or permanently. But when this is not the case, we don't have to actually think about how the body functions. So we think of the body in terms of its usage. Using the body is an everyday phenomenon. But as we can see from the photos, the same bodily function may be experienced very differently depending on who you are. So for example, if we look at the top photo there, squatting is usually very easy for children, but we lose the ability to squat as we grow into adulthood, because we then are used to sitting on chairs. In fact, we are discouraged in Western societies from sitting in a squat-like position, and obviously we then, as can be evidenced in the third picture, have to go to the gym to learn how to squat. However, if we look at the middle picture there, you can see that there's an adult sitting in a squatting position. And for those of you who may have traveled, for example, to India, you'll note that the squat position is very common for adults to sit in. So there's both a cultural element and an age-related element to how we use our bodies in different ways. So if you go to the gym and try to squat, your brain may then be thinking, oh my God, this is extremely difficult. But if you're used to squatting, it'll just become a phenomenon of the everyday. Marcel Mauss, who was a French anthropologist working in the 20th century, also was interested in embodiment, and he liked to think of the body as a tool and used the notion of techniques of the body. Mauss observed that in all societies people use their bodies, but that they use them differently, and that the way we use our bodies changes over time. The squatting example that I just mentioned speaks to this. Mauss noted that while using the body appears natural, it obviously has to be learnt. He notes, for example, changes in swimming fashion and different ways that people walked that he observed that it had changed during his lifetime. Children might imitate the movements of the body, but ultimately education overrides imitation. We are educated to use our bodies in certain ways and not in other ways. So for example, once a child knows how to walk, we encourage her not to crawl anymore. But we may well ask, why is that the case? It's been noted that crawling actually is healthy for you, even as an adult. However, in our societies, once you know how to walk, you are encouraged not to crawl. So education overrides the ability of the body to do certain things. Mauss calls the way that we use our bodies techniques. And he says, I call technique an action that is effective and traditional. It is traditional because we transmit the techniques. In other words, we educate others to do them. This is what, for Mauss, distinguishes human beings from animals. Animals do not usually teach their young how to use their bodies in particular ways, but we, as human beings, do so. Mauss also says the body is man's first and most natural technical object, and at the same time his first technical means. In other words, before human beings used machines or tools, they used their bodies to do things, to interact with the world. And we still experience our body as something that enables us to do things. We use our body to write, to walk, speak, run, swim, have sex, eat, and so on. So our body, for us, is a tool. Think about what it means not to experience our bodies as an everyday, banal tool. What if we actually had to think about each action rather than just perform them as second nature? In other words, embodying them. And this becomes critical, of course, for disabled people who often have to think about the ways in which their body functions for them. Mauss and other theorists of the body are interested in the impact of the fact that we all have bodies that we use on the way we live with others. In other words, how the body is shaped by and shapes cultures. If we take squatting again, Mauss talks about squatting under techniques of rest. Now obviously this is interesting because, as he says, and I quote, "Try squatting. You will realize the torture that a Moroccan meal eaten according to the rituals will cause you. The way of sitting down is fundamental." In other words, he's talking about the fact that for most Western people, as mentioned earlier, squatting throughout an entire meal would be agony, while for Moroccans, Indians, Southeast Asians, and so on, it is second nature. Arguably, this is a function or a technique that is being lost as these societies today, unlike in Mauser's time, become more modernized. So, for example, the replacement of the so-called Turkish toilet with the Western toilet in countries where the squatting toilet was traditional. As Maus shows, we develop certain bodily techniques because of our environment. We don't need to squat, obviously, because we have chairs, even very often in public places. But Maus gives us an example of a trip he made into the Australian outback with some white Australians a century or so ago. It's interesting, he says, when we made a stop in mud or water, they, in other words the Australians, could sit down on their heels to rest, and the flut, as it was called, in other words the mud, stayed below their heels. I was forced, and he's a French Parisian, he was saying, I was forced to stay standing up in my boots with my whole foot in the water. In other words, the Australians in those days were used to squatting in ways that obviously today most people are no longer. Our environment has changed to the extent that some of the techniques that may have appeared natural to our recent ancestors may be completely unnatural to us today. So how we use our bodies is influenced by the society and the culture we have been educated in, as well as the time in which we live. So we change our relationship to our bodies and its techniques over time. Have a look at this picture here and think about it. How do you read it? What do you think is the relationship between these two men? What reactions do we think they would get here in Australia? The first point that I want to make here is that culture is embodied. We wear our cultures on our bodies to a large extent, as the previous examples about squatting show. The differences between the way different cultures relate to their bodies is based on a different conception of the relationship between the mind and the body. How has this relationship been thought of in the West? Everybody has heard the expression, I think, therefore I am. But what is the relationship between this expression and the theme of embodiment? If we look back to Western thought or Western philosophy, it is very much based on two things. The separation of the mind and the body, so the idea that the mind operates completely separately to the body, and also the separation between the spirit or the soul and the body. This idea originates with the French philosopher René Descartes, who lived between 1596 and 1650. He was an early antecedent of the Enlightenment, when natural or experimental science begins to separate from theology. In other words, the time at which religion begins to have less of a hold over society, and scientists and philosophers start to think about the organization of human life and society outside of the religion. Descartes' most famous quote was "Cogito ergo sum," or in other words, I think, therefore I am. What does this mean? Descartes claimed that he doubted everything that existed around him until he could provide evidence for its existence. And this is very much underpins the idea of the limitations of religion. In other words, if we don't have concrete proof of the existence of God, how can we believe that she exists? Descartes went on to say, I think, therefore I must exist. In other words, because I am a thinking person, it must prove that I am here. In other words, there therefore must be what he called a thinking thing. The thinking thing has to exist outside of or separately from the body inhabited by the person. This thinking thing, which Descartes referred to as the soul or the mind, is for him an intangible substance, and he contrasted this with the tangible substance of the body. This view separated mind and body, and as a result, we tend to see the mind as less bodily than the body, although, of course, within the brain, it is a biological organ. We call this division between mind and body Cartesian dualism, Cartesian after Descartes. Now, why would that have been important at the time that Descartes was alive? In earlier medieval and Christian conceptions of the person, the soul was not thought of as being entirely separate from the body. It was thought of very much of being still part of God's creation. Descartes was himself still a practicing Catholic, but he wanted to separate the soul from the body. And he essentially opens up the body as a domain of science. The body then becomes part of the natural world, inert matter, so a biological substance, as he said, a tangible substance that can be studied, and therefore separate from the domain of religion and morality. This has enormous ramifications for the development of Western science and medicine. In the West, we tend to think of the body and the mind as operating separately from each other due to the dominance of Cartesian dualism. In mainstream medicine, for example, there are objective, testable, in other words, bodily reasons for illness. Even in mental illness, we are very often drawn to neurological explanations rather than psychological ones. So, for example, much gene research today is founded around looking for genes for certain symptoms. For example, finding a gene for depression, rather than looking for social or cultural reasons for why depression occurs at such a high rate. And this is a major tension within different approaches to treatment. According to Varga, all religious and philosophical systems are concerned with the relationship between the mind or soul and the body, but they have different approaches to the relationship, very different to the ones proposed by Descartes. So, for example, if we take Hinduism or Buddhism, this here is a picture of a Hindu sadhu who has renounced life in the quest for nirvana. In Hinduism, the mind is not seen as superior to the body as it is in Western thought. The body is the path through which spirituality is thought to flow, and this is why, according to yoga, it is vital to keep the body healthy. For Buddhists, the body can be the instrument for the liberation of the soul, and that's why meditation is often used to control the desires of the body and rise beyond material or bodily concerns for the aim of attaining nirvana, or in other words, extinction. So in other words, the body and the mind are seen as working in tandem with each other rather than as completely separately as they are thought of traditionally in Western thought.